Hey gang, John here. I want to talk to you for a minute about Gestalt therapy and Fritz Perls. And what I'd really like to focus on is how Perls and Gestalt came to have such a broad influence on the helping professions. I think we'd all agree, watching Perls implement Gestalt therapy, that he does a bunch of things that are fairly unconventional and that we wouldn't necessarily want to do ourselves. So, given that on the surface, Gestalt is so unconventional, kind of in many ways falls outside of what we think makes up good therapy, well, how does this modality have such a broad and pervasive influence? So, in order to get a sense of this, we need to look a little bit at the roots of Gestalt, a little bit more closely at Perls, and then kind of the early formation of Gestalt therapy. So, starting with the term Gestalt, it's a German term that refers to people's perceptions, to our perceptions, and the way that we understand the world. And in this way, it's a German term that is used to define a unique patterning in which parts are integrated into the perceptual whole. So, therefore, there are three components of a gestalt. There's a thing, there's the environment in which the thing exists, and then there's the relationship between the object and the environment. So this term gestalt predates Gestalt therapy and has its own life and its own identity. And this idea of Gestalt gives rise to Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychology occurs before Gestalt therapy. So Gestalt therapy is Fritz Perls' modality and kind of derivatives of Fritz Perls' modality. Gestalt psychology, which again came before Gestalt therapy, is a kind of a broader perspective for understanding cognitive processes, psychological processes in general. And Gestalt psychology is influenced and concerned with these ideas of perception and cognition, and really of these ideas of perception and cognition as being central to psychological experience. And in this context, Gestalt psychology is kind of a very academic discipline. Wertheimer, Kohler, Kafka, these are kind of theorists first more than therapists, right? They're considering theories for how the human psychological process functions. They're theorists that are more concerned with these underlying type answers than with specific therapeutic interventions. Gestalt therapy, on the other hand, is influenced by Gestalt psychology, and it's focused more on personality, on pathology, and on therapeutic interventions. And when you hear someone say Gestalt therapy, they're almost always talking about some version of Perls' approach. So what you have here is a situation where the Gestalt psychologists, this is all kind of going back in time a little bit, but the Gestalt psychologists did not see Perls as a Gestaltist. The Gestalt psychologists, again, kind of more of a, maybe to exaggerate a little bit, kind of stuffy academics looking at big theories about why people go through certain psychological processes. Pearls, on the other hand, is a therapist and draws on Gestalt psychology in developing a psychological model or a therapeutic model. And even Pearls would say that the academic Gestaltists, of course, never accepted me. I was certainly not a pure Gestaltist. So just right off the bat, that's something to clarify. We're not going to go into Gestalt psychology a whole lot, given that we're kind of we're in a clinically oriented course right now. But it's an important distinction to kind of have operating in your mind. And again, that is that Gestalt psychology is a broad academic discipline seeking to explain human experience in a general way, whereas Gestalt therapy is the interventions developed by Pearls. And the Gestalt psychologists did not like necessarily Pearls co-opting that term, the term Gestalt, because they, of course, saw themselves as these serious academics and scientists, and Pearls is not so much in that model, right? So let's take a quick look at the background of Pearls. Born in 1893 in Berlin. So we see here again where an important theorist, part of their theory is based in their personal response to Hitler in World War II. So Pearls, born in Germany, fled Germany when Hitler came to power with his family. Met Freud in 1936, and so also has ties to that psychoanalytic school. So we see a lot of the same types of characteristics, right, that we've seen in other folks from this era. Influence or relationship with Freud, influenced by the events in Europe in the 30s, in World War I, and really working to try and put together a theory that at that time was modern and reflected historical events. Where we see Pearls start to diverge from a lot of his contemporaries is in his background in theater. So he studied theater and was in fact involved in theater. Through his experience in theater, he came to believe that nonverbal cues are an important aspect of how people express their internal experience. So let's look at that again. Nonverbal cues is important for how people express their internal experience. I think, can you guys see how this is an idea that is related to his psychoanalytic roots, right? Because we're talking about unconscious coming to the surface, right? Kind of skipping down to the bottom bullet, Pearl's psychoanalytic bona fides are kind of substantiated by the folks he studied with, Karen Horney and Wilhelm Reich, both important psychoanalytic thinkers. And then looking at the bullet right above that, certainly we have seen in our videos of Pearls that he is interested in confrontation. And it's maybe not as obvious, but certainly it's discussed in our readings, that he's also concerned with independence. So we can think of this as being parallel to autonomy or maybe maturity, if we're going to think about it in an Adlerian frame. But the confrontation piece, I would say, is more unique to Pearls. So while maybe less noted by history, Pearl's wife, Laura Pearls, was also a significant contributor to Gestalt therapy. She too came from the theater, studied existentialism. Existentialism would have also been an influence for Fritz. Given that Laura was a woman, it might not be surprising that she was specifically interested on connectedness and support. And she ran the first Gestalt Institute. So again, this is a Gestalt therapy institute, not a Gestalt psychology institute, right? So this quote, I think it's a Fritz Perls quote. I don't know, I didn't mark it clearly, but every individual, every plant, every animal has only one inborn goal: to actualize itself as it is. So we'll attribute the quote to Perls, and irrespective of whose quote it is, we can see here certainly that Perls, in many ways, is more aligned with the Adlerian kind of post-Freudian view, that people are inherently oriented towards actualization and health. So, underlining ideas for Gestalt therapy, they do reflect Gestalt psychology, but again, I think we'll see that they're somewhat distinct, or at least the types of ideas that Perls drew from Gestalt psychology fit in a distinct category, and that is that configuration or forms in terms of the whole. So that idea of object, environment, and the interaction between them, these together are what make up experience. So experience isn't just our internal experience or our external experience. It's both in the interaction between them. And really, for Perls, and probably for the Gestalt psychologists too, meaning isn't made from little pieces from one or the other, but it's derived from the whole. It's this interaction of the internal experience and the external experience. And so really it's seeking to establish a holistic view of the individual, where the person and the person's experience is reflective of a total system. And these components are interrelated, right? So that change in one affects the whole. The goals of therapy for Perls are awareness, focus on the present moment, and personal responsibility. I think even if Perls, his personality is a little bit quirky, I do think it's pretty easy to see that these awareness, focus on the present, and personal responsibility are essential to his view of psychological health, right? When we watch him in session. So these ideas give rise to some theoretical tenets, and that is man as a whole. This language is taken from Perls, hence the gendered language. Certainly today we would think more in terms of human beings are a whole, comprised of body, emotions, thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. These are all interrelated. We are part of our environment, and we can't be understood outside of our environment. We are proactive rather than reactive. So we determine our responses. There's a big choice element in Gestalt therapy. If you think about the behaviorists, where our actions are kind of pre-programmed, pre-wired to respond to stimuli in a certain way, Perls would not buy that idea. He would say that we are constantly engaging in choice. He would also say that we're capable of being aware of all of these processes. And again, these ideas are very clear, I think, in his therapeutic sessions. So he talks about wholeness, integration, and balance. This idea of wholeness, integration, and balance is rooted in the conceptualization of experience as this integrated kind of ecosystem where all of the parts of experience need to function in harmony in order for experience to be healthy and self-actualizing. When we become cut off from our emotions, for example, we start to fragment and compartmentalize. And this, in Pearl's view, is the source of neuroses. When we kind of fragment and we don't have a conceptual framework for understanding our whole, and we don't have an orientation towards being authentically representative of our whole. So Pearls wants to restore wholeness, integration, and balance for people. And then we have this idea of homeostasis versus flux. Lives are constantly in flux. There's constantly change. Dynamics are fluid. And in life, we're always working to resolve unfinished business. Well, certainly this idea of unfinished business, it's clarified to some extent in our text and then also in Pearl's demonstrations. Again, here we have an idea that you could see as being related to psychoanalytic theory, right? If you think about how Pearl's addresses unfinished business, what he's talking about is unconscious experiences or unconscious influences that have not been realized or brought into awareness. Ideas very similar to psychoanalysis, right? To psychoanalytic theory, to abreaction, to a lot of the things that we talked about when we were looking at Freud. So Pearls wants to help people increase awareness and integration so that they can successfully navigate challenges in their lives and find balance and wholeness. Related to this is the idea of integrating polarities. We have a tendency to kind of, according to Pearls, do black and white thinking. We want to put things in categories of good, bad, beautiful, ugly, strong, weak. I think our current politics as a nation probably provides a good example of this tendency. You don't have a whole lot of people on Facebook coming out and giving kind of balanced critiques of, say, the president, right, of Donald Trump. Depending on who's doing the speaking, either he's all bad and he's a really evil man, or he's good and exactly what the country needs to go forward. And you see this a lot, right? Very seldom do you see someone step forward and talk about the gray areas and the kind of give and take dynamics between good and bad, or beautiful and ugly, or strong and weak. Pearls would say that these tendencies toward polarity are also crop up as we in our individual self-identities, that we tend to think about ourselves in the same way, or aspects of ourselves in the same way, where there's aspects of ourselves that are good and there are aspects that are bad, and we're really kind of unable to connect those two, or can be unable to connect those two, and can be unable to develop a more nuanced awareness or understanding of ourselves. So Pearls wants to help us to integrate those so that we can have a more mature understanding. So a kind of overarching theme for Gestalt therapy is an idea that is taken from Gestalt psychology. And that's this idea of figure and ground. It's really the kind of a, figure ground you could think of in terms of almost an object and its surrounding. So if you look at the picture on the slide, you'll have probably seen this before. Can you see how maybe the slide alternates for you? The image on the slide alternates back and forth between being a vase and being two faces. Well, that's the interaction between the figure and the ground. With the figure in this case alternating between the vase and the faces, and the ground also alternating between being the face and the vases, depending on which you're focused on. And so, like in the image, the background and foreground are shifting, representing this idea of flux. And our goal, what we're doing as we kind of go through our days, is trying to restore balance. And as we do that, our focus is continually shifting. With the foreground, or the figure, being the thing that we're focused on, and the background being everything else. So our experience is determined by the gestalt, by the whole, by the combination of the figure and the ground. However, we are likely focused on just the figure. So while our experience is determined by the whole, we have a tendency to look at things with blinders and see just what we want to see. Pearls would be interested in kind of disabusing us of this illusion, of reminding us that there's both, right? There's what we're explicitly focused on, and there's the context, and that both are having a significant influence on our experience. Pearls is interested in this idea of the ego boundary, which is the place. It could be a physical place or an emotional, psychological place, but the place where the object or the organism and the environment meet. And he emphasizes the importance of the relationship between the object or the organism and the environment. Now, in this context, if you can think about identification versus alienation, identification would be the degree to which the object or the individual or organism is associated with the environment and is part of the environment, whereas alienation would be the degree to which the object or organism or individual is distinct from the environment. Pearls would say that we need to develop a healthy and informed understanding of this dynamic, that we need to see ourselves in such a way that we can identify with the broader context and yet maintain our individual identification as well. This is an important idea, right? If we think about maybe in terms of diagnosis and say personality disorder, a lot of the pathology inherent in personality disorders is the inability to navigate that border, right? The inability to kind of handle being an individual and part of an environment at the same time. So Pearls would say that a lot of psychological problems are the result of identifying extremely one way or the other. And I would say he was right about this, that subsequent research and theories and systems of diagnoses have found that a lot of times psychological problems do arise from an inability to navigate between a healthy sense of self and a healthy sense of self in relation to others and the broader environment. And the key for Pearls, as is the key for many folks who are rooted in psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, the key is awareness. Let's look at his quote there. It's in italics. In italics, in the white print, awareness per se, by and of itself, can be curative, because with full awareness, you can become aware of this organismic self-regulation. You can let the organism take over without interfering, without interrupting. We can rely on the wisdom of the organism. Well, this certainly sounds a lot like psychoanalysis, right? With the idea that by bringing ideas by bringing unconscious ideas or unconscious influences into the light of day, just by becoming aware of them, which is what Freud said, we can become healthy. Pearls would tell us that obstacles to this awareness are preoccupation, say with materialism, or preoccupation with self, maybe in the form of low self-esteem, and that these types of distractions, preoccupations, can create a hole in the personality. What types of stuff creates these distractions, these preoccupations? Things, life, being busy, crossing stuff off of our list, etc. Pearls talked about contact between the organism or the object or the person and the surrounding environment. And he talked about that as being important for awareness. And he believed that this could occur through the physical level or the psychological level. I think you see this very clearly in the sessions when he asks folks to focus on, say, a mannerism or something that they're doing and to exaggerate it. That these physical manifestations are important. And then in terms of the psychological level, ideas and interactions with self and others, Pearls is certainly steering awareness towards these psychological processes. The 5 stages of contact and growth, I don't think we need to run through those right here. You can certainly look at them more closely in the non-narrated slides. As you observe in Pearl's demonstrations, and Corey also focuses on this in his demonstration, Gestalt therapy is very interested in the here and now. He wants people to discuss experiences as if they're happening right now. He wants to bring everything to the present. He believes that if you take yourself out of the present, that this can lead to fragmentation. By talking about things in the past or in the future, we're kind of placing ourselves in a different environment to avoid making contact with the real environment that we're in. So this is why you see him constantly bringing people back to talk in terms of right now. Even if, let's say, they're describing a dream that they had last week, Pearl still wants them to talk about the dream as if they're in it right now. As I mentioned, and I think as you can observe, Pearl's emphasizing in his sessions, choice and individual responsibility are very important. We need to be aware of our choices and aware that we are making choices. And we need to make choices that are fueled by that awareness. This emphasis on responsibility, on autonomy, I think is very reminiscent of later psychodynamic theorists, of a lot of the theorists who broke off from Freud, right? Where we take the importance of the unconscious and kind of blend that with the importance of conscious choice making. Pearls would see psychological problems as sort of growth disorders, so as developmental issues that are caused from fragmentation, where we kind of compartmentalize all these different pieces by focusing on the past or future, which is part of fragmentation, of unhealthy ego boundaries, so not being able to see oneself accurately in the broader environment, unhealthy contact with the environment and others. It can be a product of the unhealthy ego boundaries through avoidance of responsibility, and then limited awareness. And certainly limited awareness can facilitate many of these other kind of problematic components. All of these unhealthy components can come together or can manifest in unfinished business, which you certainly see Pearl's talking about a lot throughout his sessions. How does the change process work in Gestalt therapy? Well, therapeutic alliance is actually very important. I know sometimes that doesn't come across in his sessions, but while I think sometimes it looks like Pearls can be attacking, he's actually working to develop a strong I-thou therapeutic relationship. So that would be a relationship that can kind of sustain the confrontation that he brings to therapy. I think it's a little more observable in the videos he does in the video that we watched this week with the college students. A little as an aside, I wonder if any of you all also noticed that he selects for his group, or his group that's selected for him in this video, is comprised entirely of younger, attractive women. And to me, this is pretty emblematic of the aspects of Pearls that I think sometimes we find a little troubling. I think the video is very helpful, but it's also interesting to me that you have 3 or 4 younger, much younger than him, women who are kind of very willing to engage in the Gestalt process. I think it makes it for a good illustration of therapy, but I think it would be sort of silly to not notice that he routinely seems to be paired with much, much younger women than himself in his demonstration sessions. Nevertheless, Gestalt therapy would tell us that there needs to be this promotion of trust so that clients are willing to experiment and engage in all these little scenarios and techniques that are part of the therapy. While sometimes it might look like Pearls is actively guiding this session, responsibility for change really does reside with the client. So the therapist's role is to ask focusing questions that bring clients' attention to the present and to their present feelings and thoughts. So these are going to be questions about, how does that make you feel? What do you do now? What do you do? So questions that are asked in the present tense and bring folks back to the present tense of their experience. Now, I think, again, we can ask whether or not we actually see this in the theory, but the idea would be that when the client is in the present and processing, the therapist is very kind of hands off and lets that happen. Uh, when the client is not in the present and is not processing, that's when the therapist is more directive and more confrontational, and in order to bring the client back to the here and now. I think that the danger is what happens is that the confrontation or the technique can become the focus or seem to become the focus. And I think that's a danger with any kind of really technique heavy therapy, that the technique becomes the object of the therapy, where the therapist is more interested in doing something specific, when really what we want to be doing is creating an environment where the client can complete or engage in their processing. Importantly, and I don't think that Pearls necessarily reflects this in the demonstration videos, but importantly, we would never force Gestalt techniques or experiments, as Pearls sometimes calls them. We would never force them on a client. You don't want to make someone engage in a technique that they're uncomfortable with, right? So the Gestalt therapy goals, I think we talked about this. I think most of this is pretty clearly covered. I'm going to keep going here in the interest of time. I'm going to spend a little time on this slide because I think it allows us to talk about a few different ideas. So the term games has a few meanings in Pearl's version of Gestalt. Games certainly can have a negative connotation if we're being evasive or taking, if clients are being evasive or taking actions to kind of maintain their fragmented perception or view, that could be considered a game. But then also, games can refer to certain techniques. So some of the, and I think here also you can see Pearl's theater background really come to the fore. So where Pearls wants the client to pretend to be a different person or to pretend to speak to a different person, these are games also. So you've got the games with the negative connotation that people might play to maintain their fragmented personalities, but then you also have games as a technique. And this can play out across a number of different scenarios. I think he demonstrates a few of them in the videos. They can fall into these games of unfinished business or fantasy. And you'll see them in the video, so I'm not going to talk too much about the specific interventions here. Again, sort of same deal here. I think you can see these acting out a dream, for example, and I take responsibility. I am. Excuse me. I'm trying to think here. Games focused on having folks take responsibility, and games focus on having folks explicitly list what's in their awareness. You can see all of these in the tapes, right? Same with exaggeration. You'll see him, if he notices someone maybe fiddling with a piece of paper during a session, he might ask them to exaggerate that motion, that movement, and to describe what they're feeling as they exaggerate the motion. And this, I think this is pretty well illustrated in the tapes. The idea here is that through doing this, it helps us to understand the process that is leading us towards, say, a nervous movement or kind of a unconsciously angry movement. Um, get reversal, another technique. I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time kind of outlining all the specific techniques. If there are any that are kind of listed here that I don't go into, or that the book doesn't go into, or aren't covered, stick them in Google, and you'll be able to find any of them. I'm sure described very well. So he has interventions that are focused on internal dialogue between the ego and the superego, dialogue that we might imagine between ourselves and other people, where the other people might represent different chunks of our personality. And the overall goal of these types of games is to have increased integration among the fragmented parts of self. One intervention that I do want to talk about on this page, because it's very frequently used, and I think it can be implemented by folks maybe at earlier stages in their therapeutic career. And that's the empty chair technique. And that is an intervention where the client speaks to an empty chair and imagines that in that empty chair is the person to whom they would like to be speaking, or should be speaking, and perhaps are afraid to speak to. So I think, even though there's not an actual empty chair in it, in the case of stand tape for this week, I think Corey does this pretty well when he has Stan talk to his father about unfinished business between Stan and his father. This is a technique that is used by all kinds of people, and folks who are not necessarily Gestalt therapists. And it's definitely an example of Pearl's broad influence. How is Gestalt therapy used in rehab contexts? It can be used in rehab contexts in a lot of different ways. There's been some research showing success with eating disorders, actually with disability, lost body parts, kind of reintegrating new body images after amputation or loss of body parts. And that can really apply across disabilities that entail loss, deaf, hard of hearing, conditions that may threaten longevity. So there definitely are some meaningful applications for rehabilitation. At the same time, we want to be careful, right? And I think this is the lesson taught by Pearls in his videos that he didn't necessarily mean to teach, but I think through watching him, we can see that we would want to be very careful implementing these interventions and want to feel confident about our ability to use them and make sure that we're using them with folks that aren't going to be damaged by them. Where sometimes Pearls, I think, comes across a little overconfident in his willingness to try some of these kind of out there interventions. I think it's also important to mention that even when we have a client for whom some of these interventions may be appropriate and helpful, the client needs to be especially cognizant of, the therapist needs to be especially cognizant of personal boundaries. Going back to the college student tape, and the tape with these young women who appear to be pretty ready to want to help Pearls demonstrate his theory. They're really ready to play along and kind of interested and invested in the session. I don't think it takes too much imagination, and without kind of minimizing the capabilities of the women in the video, I don't think it takes too much imagination to see where these types of interventions in a therapeutic relationship, where the client does not perceive to have a lot of power, they could lead to intentional or accidental manipulation of a client. Things get really kind of intimate between Pearls and the clients, right? So as he's engaging in these interventions, as therapists are engaging in these interventions, the therapist needs to be cognizant in every minute that they are engaging in a therapeutic relationship, and that they are not engaging in an ordinary intimate relationship, right? And of course, it's important to maintain unconditional positive regard. That, especially if we're going to confront clients with parts of their personalities that are difficult for them to handle, we can't be doing that from a place of judgment. We can't be doing that in a way that is kind of a gotcha game. It really has to come from a benign place of unconditional positive regard. What are the limitations of Gestalt? It's not going to work very well with clients who do not have a capacity for insight and self-reflection. A lot of the interventions would just be, I think, confusing and not helpful. It's not going to be a good idea to use Gestalt type interventions with folks who have severe mental health issues, especially mental health issues that involve any kind of psychosis, where they're suggestible to the extent that they can believe and see things that aren't necessarily real in the actual environment. We want to make sure that we're using interventions only that we know how to use. And then, as we'll see, as we have seen for a lot of therapeutic models, a lot of the kind of more articulated, maybe more out there therapeutic models, they're difficult to generate empirical evidence for. Doesn't mean they don't work, and there is actually a handful of evidence, as I mentioned, for like eating disorders, and there has been research done on Gestalt therapy. However, it can be difficult to design studies that effectively test the model, so there's not as much empirical research as we would like. So thinking about Gestalt and rehab, Gestalt can be helpful to help folks increase emotional coping and growth related to disability issues. In rehab situations, we want to think about Gestalt techniques kind of more in little chunks. I don't think we're going to want to, there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for folks to come into our office and do strict Gestalt therapy, much in the same way that we're not going to do strict psychoanalytic therapy. And in this way, it can be very helpful to blend Gestalt techniques, like the empty chair, with other therapies. And then, kind of in conclusion, the big points for Pearls, or some of the big points for Pearls, focus on the here and now. Very technique heavy and action heavy therapeutic model. Can be helpful for folks who seem kind of trapped in their heads and deal with everything intellectually and thinking. You'll see this in clients a lot, right? Folks who are really hesitant to shift into kind of an emotional mode and stick in that thinking mode. Well, Gestalt can be helpful for that. And all of this is oriented towards the goals of becoming better emotional processors and integrating kind of the disparate areas of our inner and outer worlds. And this orientation towards integration of the whole self definitely has applicability, certainly in terms of a way of thinking, especially a framework for thinking, has applicability towards overcoming difficulties in adjustment related to disability and coping with disability and emotional aspects of disability. So that's what I got for this week. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'll talk to you soon.